"Excuse me, have you seen my parents, Marcus and Ruth Allen? Do they still live near the harbor? You're Marcus Allen's boy. You better come with me right now." "Mama, Daddy, what happened to you? Don't let your brother know you came back here. You sit there and lie to a courtroom like that. I thought I could fix it before you found out." "Fix it? I'm not lying. I'm holding this family together." Elijah Allen stepped off the gangway of his 96-foot yacht at the Fairhaven Marina, expecting to surprise his parents after 11 years away. Instead, a dockmaster who had known his father since the 70s pulled him aside beneath a flickering harbor light and quietly pointed him toward the old industrial strip behind the fish market. Between a boarded-up bait warehouse and a rusted-out shipping container sat a leaning wooden building with the faded sign Allen's Tires still hanging above the open bay. Inside, his 76-year-old father was hammering a patch into a truck tire with swollen knuckles that no longer closed all the way, while his mother folded thin blankets on a cot pushed against a stack of retreaded rims. The two-story house on Magnolia Street that Elijah had paid off in cash 6 years ago was gone. The retirement account he wired into every month was empty, and when he asked his mother why she was sleeping on a cot beside a kerosene heater, she looked over his shoulder toward the road and whispered, "Please, baby, don't tell your brother you came here." The fear in her eyes hurt him worse than the smell of oil and mildew soaking into the walls behind her. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists that stay with you long after the video ends, take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another one. And before we go any further, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. 11 years earlier, Elijah had left the coast of Georgia believing every mile he put between himself and home was another brick in the future he was building for the people he loved most. At 43, Elijah Allen had become the kind of man local papers wanted to write features about. He owned a marine logistics firm that moved specialty cargo up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and 4 months earlier he had sold a controlling interest to a Miami investment group for a figure that still didn't feel real when he saw it written down. Colleagues sent champagne. Trade magazines called for interviews. His crew threw him a farewell dinner at a rooftop restaurant in Savannah. But standing on the aft deck of the yacht, he had finally allowed himself to buy, watching the coastline of his hometown crawl closer through a light gray drizzle. None of that success felt like the real reward. What he kept picturing was his mother's face when she saw him walking up the front steps unannounced. Marcus and Ruth Allen had spent every year of their marriage inside the same salt-worn town outside Brunswick. His father had run a small tire and repair shop off Route 17 for as long as anyone could remember, patching flats for shrimpers who paid in cash or crab traps, or sometimes not at all. His mother had taught first grade at the elementary school for 31 years before her knees finally forced her to retire. They had never been rich, but their kitchen door had never been locked either, and half the town had eaten a plate of Ruth Allen's peach cobbler at least once. Elijah smiled to himself as the marina crew tied off his lines. He pictured his mother's hands going to her mouth. He pictured his father pretending not to cry. He hadn't told them he was coming. Not this time. The smile faded because guilt always arrived faster than joy. The truth was that Elijah had not come home nearly enough. There had always been another contract, another port, another quarter closing, another reason next month would work better. He called. He sent money every single month without fail. He paid off the house. He set up an account that was supposed to cover anything they ever needed. He had convinced himself, mile by mile, that providing was the same thing as showing up. Deep down, he had always known it wasn't. When the crew finished securing the yacht, Elijah pulled a light jacket over his shoulders and stepped onto the dock. The rain had thinned into a mist that clung to the wooden planks and softened every edge of the harbor. He rented an SUV from a small agency near the marina office and pointed it toward the old part of town. The streets looked narrower than he remembered. The oak trees along Bay Avenue had grown into each other overhead, forming a green tunnel that used to feel magical when he was a boy and now just felt tired. Everything was familiar and strange at the same time. the way places always were when you'd been gone long enough for the town to keep living without you. He tried calling his parents from the car. His mother's cell rang 4 times and dropped into voicemail. He tried again 10 minutes later, straight to voicemail this time. That was unusual. Ruth Allen answered every call, even when she was in the middle of church. He tried the landline, disconnected. That stopped him. He pulled over at a gas station on the corner of 5th and Bay and sat with the engine running, staring at his phone. Disconnected numbers didn't just happen. Somebody had to stop paying a bill or somebody had to move. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation. He drove into the small florist shop on Magnolia and bought a bouquet of the yellow roses his mother had planted along the side of the house for as long as he could remember. Then he drove the last 4 blocks to the address he had been sending money to for over a decade. The house should have appeared at the top of the small rise where Magnolia curved past the church. Instead, he found a vacant lot with a for sale sign already leaning sideways in the weeds. Elijah hit the brakes so hard the tires skidded across wet asphalt. For a long moment, he simply sat with both hands on the wheel, staring. The house was gone. Not damaged, not boarded up, gone. The concrete foundation had been broken up and hauled away. Weeds had already started reclaiming the ground where his mother's roses used to climb the porch railing. He stepped out of the SUV and walked to the middle of what used to be the living room. The mist settled on his shoulders. He could still picture exactly where the front door had been, where the coat rack stood, where his father used to leave his work boots. None of it was there. An older woman in a pink housecoat came slowly out onto the porch of the house next door, squinting through the drizzle. She held up a hand to shade her eyes, and then her whole expression changed. "Elijah," she called out. He turned toward her. "Miss Loretta." The old neighbor walked to her fence in a careful, uneven step. "Lord have mercy, child. We haven't seen you around here in a long, long time. What happened to my parents' house?" he asked. The words came out sharper than he meant them to. Miss Loretta's face shifted immediately. Not surprise, not confusion. Something closer to sorrow that she had been carrying for a while. She glanced across the street, then back at him, and lowered her voice. "Baby, you don't know." His stomach dropped. "Don't know what?" "They haven't been in that house for going on 2 years now." The words hit harder than he expected. "Where are they living?" he asked. "I thought Terrell told you." Elijah felt his jaw tighten at the sound of his older brother's name. The one who had promised to keep an eye on things. The one who cashed checks on their behalf when their father's hands started acting up. "What did Terrell tell me?" Miss Loretta hesitated. She glanced toward the road again, the way people do when they've learned that certain conversations were better held in private. Then she just shook her head slowly. "You need to go talk to Sheriff Boone, honey. He'll tell you what's what." An hour later, Sheriff Boone didn't have many answers either, but he had enough to point Elijah toward the industrial strip behind the fish market, where an old tire shop had somehow gained 2 new residents nobody in town liked to talk about above a whisper. Elijah followed Sheriff Boone's directions in stunned silence, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter every time the road narrowed. The paved streets of downtown gave way to cracked asphalt, then to a stretch of packed gravel that ran behind the working piers. The air changed as he drove. Salt gave way to the sharper smell of diesel, and the diesel gave way to something older and heavier, the layered scent of rubber, motor oil, and rusting metal that clung to any place where machines went to die. He turned past the fish market, past a chain-link fence hung with rotting nets, and there it was. A leaning wooden building with a corrugated tin roof and a hand-painted sign that read Allen's Tires in letters so faded he could barely make them out. He remembered the sign. His father had painted it himself back when Elijah was still small enough to sit on an oil drum and hand him nails. That building had once stood on the main road, right where every trucker coming off Route 17 could see it. Somehow it had ended up here, tucked between a warehouse and a shipping container, as if the whole business had been pushed to the edge of town and forgotten. Elijah killed the engine and stepped out. The mist had turned into a fine rain that darkened his jacket almost immediately. He walked toward the open bay door, and every step felt heavier than the last. Inside, a single bare bulb hung from an extension cord, casting yellow light over the room. Truck tires were stacked in unstable towers against the walls. A workbench along one side held rows of old tools laid out with the careful precision of a man who no longer had the strength to look for anything twice. And there, bent over a tire on a rusted balancing stand, was his father. Marcus Allen was hammering a patch into the sidewall with a rubber mallet, his shoulders rising and falling with each stroke in a rhythm that used to be effortless. Now every swing looked like it cost him something. His hair had gone entirely white. His hands were swollen at the knuckles, the fingers curled slightly inward, and there was a tremor in them that hadn't been there the last time Elijah shook them. For a long moment, neither man moved. Elijah didn't know how to announce himself. He didn't know how to explain the yacht at the marina, the closed contracts, the 11 years, the yellow roses on the passenger seat of his rented SUV. Then Marcus looked up and saw him, and the mallet slipped from his hand and hit the concrete floor with a dull thud. Behind him, from the shadows near the back of the shop, a soft voice said, "Lord Jesus." Ruth Allen stepped out from behind a curtain that had been hung across a corner of the shop with baling wire. She was thinner than Elijah remembered, so much thinner that the housecoat she wore hung on her frame like it belonged to someone else. She was holding a folded blanket against her chest, and when she saw her son standing in the doorway, the blanket dropped to the floor. Elijah crossed the shop in 4 long strides and gathered her into his arms. She felt like paper. That was the thought that broke him. His mother, who had once carried a laundry basket on one hip and a toddler on the other, felt like paper against his chest. She was trembling, and it took him a moment to realize she wasn't only trembling from surprise. She was trembling from fear. "What happened to you, Mama?" he whispered into her hair. "What happened here?" She didn't answer. She looked past his shoulder out the open bay door toward the road the way a person looks when they're expecting someone to appear at any second. Then she reached up and gripped both his shoulders with a strength that surprised him. Her fingers dug in. "Baby," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. "Baby, listen to Mama. Don't you call your brother. Don't you tell nobody in town you came. Not yet." Elijah stared down at her, his own hands frozen where they had been holding her. Of all the things he had prepared himself to hear tonight, that was not one of them, not even close. "Daddy," Elijah said quietly, turning his head toward the workbench without letting go of his mother's shoulders. "What is she talking about?" Marcus Allen slowly straightened up from the tire stand, one hand pressed against the small of his back. He didn't answer right away. He walked over to a folding chair by the workbench and lowered himself into it in stages, like a man who had learned that sitting down too fast could cost him the rest of the afternoon. He wiped his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth. Then he looked at his son, and the look on his face was something Elijah had never seen there before. Marcus Allen had faced down the sheriff's deputies during a strike in 1979. He had held Elijah's hand through the funeral of his own mother in the front pew of Second Baptist, without letting a single tear fall until the doors closed behind them. He had walked out of the hospital 3 months after a bypass surgery in his 60s, and gone straight back to the shop the next Monday. But right now, in a leaning wooden building behind a fish market, Marcus Allen looked afraid. "Come on back here, son," Marcus finally said, gesturing toward the curtain corner Ruth had stepped out of. "Come see how we live." The curtain was blue and white gingham, the exact pattern Ruth used to sew into her kitchen towels. Elijah recognized it and felt something twist behind his ribs. Behind the curtain was a space no bigger than a small bedroom. A cot with a thin mattress sat against one wall. A second cot leaned folded against a stack of tires. There was a plastic milk crate serving as a nightstand, with a battery-powered lantern on top and a King James Bible with the cover falling off beside it. A propane camp stove sat on an overturned wooden pallet. There was a plug-in kettle, 2 mismatched mugs, and a small ceramic pitcher of yellow roses, dried and brittle now, that his mother had clearly kept long past when she should have thrown them away. Everything in that little space was clean. That was the part that hurt. It was clean the way people kept things clean when they had almost nothing left, because cleanliness was the last dignity they could still afford. Ruth stepped past him and set an old percolator on the camp stove. Her hands moved out of habit more than intention. "Sit down, baby," she said softly. "I'll pour you some coffee." He didn't want coffee. He wanted answers. But he recognized the look on her face, the same look she used to give him at the kitchen table when he came home upset from school and she needed a minute to figure out how to talk to him. He sat down on an overturned crate. She poured. When she set the mug in front of him, he saw the chip on the rim and his throat closed. It was his grandfather's mug, the one Marcus had drunk out of every morning for as long as Elijah could remember. Somebody had carried it out of the house on Magnolia Street and brought it here, to this dirty little shop behind the fish market, and set it on a milk crate like it was a relic worth preserving. Maybe it was. "Mama," he said carefully, "please tell me what's going on." Ruth sat down across from him on the second crate. Marcus lowered himself onto the edge of the cot. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The rain drummed softly on the tin roof above them, and somewhere out in the harbor a bell buoy tolled once, twice, and then went silent. "How long can you stay, baby?" his mother finally asked. He blinked. "What kind of question is that, Mama? I can stay as long as I need to stay." Something in her shoulders eased a fraction, the way a person relaxes when they finally believe help has arrived. But behind that relief was still that other thing, the fear, and it hadn't moved. "We thought you was coming next month," she said. "Terrell told us next month. What difference does a month make, Mama?" She looked down at her folded hands. "It gave us more time," she whispered. "More time for what, Mama?" Elijah asked. His voice came out softer than he intended because he could see her hands starting to shake in her lap and he didn't want to be the one to make them shake harder. Ruth didn't answer. She stared at the top of the milk crate between them, as if the answer might be written there in the wood grain. Marcus cleared his throat from the cot. "Boy, your mama and me been carrying some things," he said. "We ain't been carrying them well." That was as close to an admission as his father had ever come to anything in his life. Elijah slowly reached across the crate and took his mother's hands in his own. Her knuckles were rough. Somewhere along the way she had started doing work with those hands that they weren't built for anymore. "Mama, look at me." Ruth looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't let a tear fall yet. His mother never had been much of a crier in front of her boys. "Where's the money been going?" he asked. She flinched, just barely, but he saw it. "The money I've been sending you every month for 11 years. The retirement account." "Where's it been going, Mama?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Then she did something that broke something in him. She looked at Marcus. She looked at her husband like a child who had gotten caught and needed permission to speak. And Marcus, sitting on the edge of that thin cot, gave her the smallest nod. "Baby," she said, "your brother needed help." There it was. The sentence he had been dreading since Miss Loretta lowered her voice at the fence line. He didn't react. He didn't pull his hands away from hers. He just held on and asked, "What kind of help, Mama?" Ruth's mouth trembled. "Terrell had a hard run of it. His shop closed. He lost the tow business too. Then that woman, that Yvette woman, took the boys down to Jacksonville and put a lawyer on him. He was drowning, baby. He came to us." Elijah felt his jaw lock. "He forced it open again, so you gave him the money I sent. Some of it," she was whispering now, "and then he needed more. And more. He always said next month, baby. He always said next month he'd have it back." Elijah closed his eyes. He could see it perfectly. He could see his older brother sitting at their mother's kitchen table with his hat in his hands, telling her a story she wanted to believe because it was the only story a mother could believe about her firstborn. He could see her writing a check. He could see her writing another one. "The house," he said, opening his eyes. "What happened to the house on Magnolia Street?" Marcus answered this time. He had gone quiet inside himself, the way old men do when they finally decide to speak the thing they have not spoken. "Terrell took a second mortgage on it," he said. Elijah stared at him. "Daddy, that house was paid off. I paid it off 6 years ago. I have the papers on my boat right now." Marcus nodded slowly, not disagreeing, just accepting. "Boy," he said, "there's paid off and then there's paid off. Your brother had power of attorney over our affairs for a stretch. When my hands got bad and your mama's memory started going sideways after that little stroke she had, we signed some things." Elijah went very still. "Stroke. Mama had a stroke. When?" Ruth squeezed his hand quickly. "It was a little one, baby. A little one. Doctors called it a mini something." She recovered fine, Marcus said, but there was a stretch of about 4 months there where she wasn't herself. And I wasn't either, if I'm being honest. My sugar was up. My blood pressure was up. Terrell was over here every day helping with the shop and the bills, and he brought papers and we signed. So the house isn't paid off anymore, Elijah said flatly. Marcus shook his head. Bank took it back a year and a half ago. Terrell said he was working on it. Then one Tuesday the sheriff put a notice on the front door. Elijah sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain hit the tin roof. There was a slow, cold weight settling into his chest, the kind of weight that arrives when a person finally understands that the world they thought they had built for the people they love had never actually existed. The money had been water poured into a bucket with a hole cut in the bottom, and everyone had watched it drain except him. He gently let go of his mother's hands. He stood up. He walked out from behind the gingham curtain, across the concrete floor, past the tire stand where his father's rubber mallet still lay where it had fallen. He stood in the open bay door and looked out at the rain. Somewhere on the other side of that harbor, past the yellow lights of the marina, his yacht was rocking softly against its fenders. 96 feet of white fiberglass and teak, staffed by 2 crew he was paying by the day. He had spent more on the interior refit than his father had earned in the last 20 years of running Allen's tires, and his parents were sleeping on cots. He put his hand against the doorframe and breathed slowly through his nose until the shaking in his shoulders eased. He was not going to lose his temper in front of his mother. Not tonight. Not ever, if he could help it. When he turned around, Marcus was standing behind him. The old man had gotten up from the cot without a sound. "Son," Marcus said quietly. "Yes, sir. Your brother don't know you're here." "That right?" Elijah nodded. "Miss Loretta didn't call him. Sheriff Boone didn't call him. Nobody knows I docked except the marina office." Marcus rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand. Then he did something unexpected. He put his hand on Elijah's shoulder and squeezed once hard, the way he used to when Elijah was 15 and had done something right for a change. "Keep it that way for a day or two," Marcus said. "Give your mama and me time to sit down with you and lay it all out proper. There's things she needs to say. There's things I need to say. Ain't none of it going to make sense in one night." Elijah looked at his father. "Daddy, I need to know one thing right now. Ask, are y'all safe out here?" Marcus took a long breath. He glanced back toward the gingham curtain, where Ruth had begun to hum softly to herself, the way she always did when she was trying to keep from crying. "Safe enough," he said. "Terrell comes by. He brings groceries some weeks. He talks." That word "talks" landed strangely. Elijah didn't push it yet. He filed it away the way he had learned to file things away in every negotiation he had ever walked into. Sometimes the most important thing a man said was the word he chose to end a sentence with. "All right," Elijah said. "I'll stay quiet for now. Where can I sleep tonight?" Marcus almost smiled. "Boy, you got a boat." Elijah shook his head. "I'm not sleeping on a boat while y'all sleep on cots. If it's all right with you and Mama, I'll sleep out here on the floor by the bench." Marcus started to protest, but Ruth's voice came softly from behind the curtain. "Let him stay, Marcus. Let my baby stay." So he stayed. That night Elijah lay on a folded canvas tarp on the concrete floor of Allen's tires with his jacket rolled up under his head and stared at the underside of the tin roof. His mother's soft humming had faded into the slow, uneven breathing of sleep. His father snored the way he had always snored, in 3 short bursts followed by a long silence that used to scare Elijah as a boy because he was convinced the old man had died between breaths. Every few minutes a car passed on the gravel road outside, its headlights sweeping through the gaps in the wooden walls in long yellow bars. Around 1 in the morning, one of those cars slowed. It didn't stop. It didn't pull in. It just slowed almost to a crawl at the edge of the property, sat there for maybe 30 seconds, and then rolled on. Elijah did not move. He lay perfectly still and listened until the sound of the engine faded back into the distance. Elijah was up before the sun. He folded the tarp, set it neatly against the workbench, and stepped outside into the gray hour before dawn. The rain had stopped in the night. The gravel yard was slick and dark, and the air smelled of wet rope and low tide. He walked a slow perimeter of the property. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe just proof that he wasn't imagining any of it. He found tire tracks in the soft mud at the edge of the road. Wide truck tires, the tread deep and fresh, sitting exactly where the car had slowed the night before. He crouched down beside them for a long moment. Then he stood up, brushed off his hands, and walked back inside. His mother was already awake. She was pouring water into the percolator, humming that same soft hymn under her breath. "Baby," she said without turning around, "you go on down to that diner on 3rd Street and get yourself a proper breakfast. Miss Cheryl still opens at 5. I'm not hungry, Mama." "Yes, you are." She turned and looked at him. There was something in her face that morning that hadn't been there the night before, a small, tired brightness, as if just knowing he was still under the same roof had given her something back. "Go on. Bring me a biscuit if you want to be useful." He drove into town. The sky was starting to turn silver over the rooftops. Miss Cheryl's diner sat exactly where it had sat for 40 years, on the corner of 3rd and Bay, with the same red vinyl booths visible through the fogged-up windows. The bell above the door jingled when he pushed it open, and half the counter turned to look at him. He saw the recognition move through the room like a wave. A man in a mail carrier's uniform set his coffee down. A woman in scrubs stopped chewing. Miss Cheryl herself, older and rounder than he remembered but with the same iron-gray hair pulled back tight, came out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "Elijah Allen," she said. He gave her a small, tired smile. "Morning, Miss Cheryl." She looked him up and down. Then she jerked her head toward an empty booth in the back corner. "Sit." She brought him coffee without asking. She brought him grits and eggs and country ham and a biscuit the size of his fist without asking. Then she slid into the booth across from him with her own coffee cup, and she looked at him hard. "You seen your folks yet?" she said. He nodded once. Her shoulders dropped. Something she had been holding for a long time let go. "Thank the Lord," she said. "Baby, we've been worried." "Miss Cheryl," he said carefully. "How long have people around here known?" She sighed. "Sugar, we started noticing about 2 years ago. Ruth stopped coming to Wednesday night service. Then Marcus stopped bringing the truck in for coffee on Saturday mornings. Then somebody said they'd seen a for sale sign on the house. Then somebody else said the sign was gone but nobody had moved in. Little pieces." She stirred her coffee slowly. "Then last summer Deacon Hollies was driving out to check on the shrimp boats, and he saw your daddy pushing a hand truck full of tires around behind the fish market. Deacon come back and told the pastor, and the pastor come down here and told me." She looked up. Nobody could get a straight answer out of Ruth about any of it. "And you know Marcus. That man ain't never explained himself to nobody in his life." "Did anybody try to help them?" Elijah asked. Miss Cheryl's mouth tightened. "We tried. Pastor Hollies brought food. I sent plates. Miss Loretta from next door to the old house tried to sit Ruth down for a real talk. Every time Ruth would smile and thank us and tell us they was just going through a little rough patch and Terrell was handling everything. She'd say it in that same sweet voice she always used to use in Sunday school. And that was that." Elijah nodded slowly. He set his fork down. He looked at Miss Cheryl across the table. "Ma'am," he said. "Tell me about my brother." Miss Cheryl took a long sip of her coffee before she answered. She set the mug down carefully, the way people do when they're choosing words that could hurt somebody. "Baby," she said, "your brother ain't the same man you remember." Elijah waited. "Terrell came back to town about 8 years ago," she said, "after that mess with the finance company up in Atlanta. He was quiet at first, living out at the old fishing cabin your granddaddy left, working odd jobs. Everybody figured he'd had a rough patch and was straightening himself out. Then he opened up that tow truck operation off Route 17, bought 2 trucks, then 3. Then he opened a used car lot next to it. For a while there he was flying sugar, wearing suits to church, driving a big black Escalade, handing out $20 bills to kids at the Little League games." She shook her head slowly. "Then about 4 years ago it all started coming apart. The tow business lost the contract with the county. Somebody said he'd been double billing. The car lot got shut down over the titles. His girlfriend Yvette took the 2 boys and moved to Jacksonville. He got real quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Mean quiet." Elijah leaned forward. "Mean how?" Miss Cheryl glanced around the diner and lowered her voice. "He started showing up places where he wasn't invited. Little league games where his boys weren't even playing anymore. Church suppers he hadn't been to in a year, standing in the back of rooms watching people. And anytime somebody asked after your mama and daddy, he had a story ready, always a story. Ruth had the flu. Marcus was down with his back. They was up in Atlanta visiting cousins. They was on a cruise, if you can believe that one. She almost laughed. Your mama has never been on a boat bigger than a bass boat in her life. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment. So people stopped asking, he said. People stopped asking, Miss Cheryl agreed, because it got uncomfortable, and because your brother has a way about him now. He looks at a person a certain kind of way. It makes them decide they don't need to know the answer that bad. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Baby, she said, there's something else. He opened his eyes. About 6 months back, Deacon Hollies went out to the tire shop to bring your mama a plate. Terrell was there. Terrell told the deacon that Ruth wasn't well in her head, that she was making up stories, that if the deacon heard anything strange from her, he should come to Terrell first before he did anything foolish. She squeezed his hand. Deacon Hollies is 78 years old and he don't scare easy, but he told me later that the way Terrell said it made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. Elijah sat very still. So my brother has been telling this whole town that my mama is losing her mind, he said quietly. So they'll doubt her if she ever tries to ask for help. Miss Cheryl didn't answer. She didn't have to. Elijah paid the bill. He asked Miss Cheryl to box up 2 biscuits and a container of grits for his mother. He walked out to the SUV and sat in the parking lot for a full 5 minutes with both hands on the steering wheel, breathing slow, forcing the heat in his chest to cool into something useful. Then he made 2 phone calls. The first was to his personal attorney in Miami, a woman named Denise Rivera who had walked him through the sale of his company. He told her in as few words as he could manage what he had walked into. He asked her to find him a local elder law attorney in coastal Georgia by end of business today. Denise did not ask questions. She said, give me 2 hours. The second call was to the harbor master at Fairhaven Marina. He asked, very politely, that no information about his boat, his slip number, or his presence in town be given to anyone who called asking. The harbor master, an old Coast Guard man named Pete who had known Marcus for 30 years, said, son, I already figured that. You take your time. On the drive back to the tire shop, Elijah passed a black Escalade heading the other direction, and the driver did not look at him. Elijah kept driving. He did not slow down. He did not turn his head. He watched the Escalade shrink in his rearview mirror until it disappeared around the bend by the old cannery, and then he pulled over on the shoulder of the gravel road and sat with the engine idling. His hands were steady on the wheel. That surprised him. He had expected them to shake. When he got back to the shop, his father was already at the workbench, cleaning a set of lug nuts with a wire brush. Ruth was sitting on the cot behind the curtain with the Bible open in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. She was just looking at the page the way a person looks at a photograph of someone they miss. Elijah set the biscuits and grits down on the milk crate. Mama, he said. Did Terrell come by this morning? She looked up. Her face changed. He drove past, she said quietly. He didn't stop. He drove past slow. That was around 6 before you got back. Daddy, Elijah said. Marcus didn't look up from the lug nuts. I heard him, he said. I laid still. Ruth folded her hands over the Bible. Baby, she said. He knows something changed. He always knows. He watches this shop like a hawk watches a henhouse. Elijah crouched down in front of her cot so his face was level with hers. Mama, he said, I need you to listen to me. I'm not going to make a scene. I'm not going to raise my voice at your son, but I am going to fix this. And to fix it, I need you to tell me the truth about one thing. She waited. Did Terrell ever put his hands on you or Daddy? Ruth's eyes filled up, but she shook her head. No, baby, he never hit us, he just... She stopped. She looked past Elijah out through the gap in the curtain at the open bay door. He just talks a certain way now, she whispered. He stands too close. He tells me I'm confused. He tells your daddy he's an old fool who's going to lose the shop if he don't sign what Terrell brings him. He tells me you're too busy up there with your rich friends to care. He tells me if I make trouble you won't come home no more. Elijah reached out and took both her hands again. Mama, he said, look at me. She looked at him. I came home, he said. She started to cry then, not loud, She never cried loud. Just a slow, steady leak, the way a woman cries when she has been holding it in for 2 years and has finally been given permission to stop. Marcus set the wire brush down on the workbench very carefully and turned around and walked out through the bay door into the yard. He stood out there in the gray morning light with his back to them for a long time. Elijah let him have it. Some things a man had to do without an audience. By 10 o'clock, Denise Rivera had called back. She had found him a lawyer in Brunswick, a woman named Alicia Prescott who specialized in elder financial abuse and had prosecuted 3 cases against sons and daughters in the last 4 years. Alicia had cleared her afternoon. She would meet Elijah at her office at 1. Elijah asked his father to come with him. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "Boy," he said. "You sure?" "I'm sure, Daddy." Marcus nodded. He went behind the curtain and came back out 10 minutes later in a clean button-down shirt and a pair of pressed slacks that had clearly been folded in a suitcase somewhere in the shop for a long time. His shoes were polished. Ruth had shined them for him. Elijah understood, watching his father walk across the concrete floor in his Sunday shoes, that Marcus Allen had been waiting a long time to walk into a room and tell the truth to somebody who would listen. Alicia Prescott's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building on Newcastle Street. She was younger than Elijah expected, maybe 40, with locks pulled back into a low bun and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She shook Marcus's hand first, then Elijah's. Then she closed the door and said, "Gentlemen, tell me everything." They told her everything. Marcus spoke first in that slow, careful way of his, laying it down piece by piece the way he would lay out tools on the workbench. The stroke, the papers, the power of attorney, the second mortgage, the signatures he couldn't remember making. The Sunday afternoon a year and a half ago when the sheriff had knocked on the door of the house on Magnolia Street with a foreclosure notice, and Terrell had shown up an hour later with a rented U-Haul and told them not to worry. He had a place lined up for them behind the fish market, just for a little while, just till things got sorted. That little while had lasted 17 months. Alicia listened without interrupting. She took notes in a leather folder. When Marcus finished, she asked him 3 quiet questions. Did he still have any of the paperwork Terrell had brought him to sign? Did any of it exist in his handwriting in his own words without Terrell in the room? And did he understand, right now, sitting in this office, what he was asking her to do? Marcus answered yes to all 3. Then she turned to Elijah. "Mr. Allen," she said, "what you're describing is a pattern of elder financial exploitation that in this state carries both civil and criminal exposure. Recovery of assets is possible. Restoration of the property title is possible. Criminal charges are possible. But I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is your brother. The state will not pursue what your parents will not support. And even if we recover every dollar and every deed, there is no version of the next 12 months that does not put your mother in a witness chair across from her firstborn son." Elijah looked at his father. Marcus looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he lifted his head. "Ma'am," he said, "my son Terrell is a grown man. He made choices. I made choices too. I let him, that's on me. But my wife did not choose any of this. She's been sleeping on a cot behind a tire shop for a year and a half because she was afraid of losing her boy. She ain't losing him. He was already lost. What she needs to get back is her house and her name and her front porch. And I am prepared to sit in whatever chair you put me in to make that happen." Alicia nodded slowly. "Then we begin today," she said. They began that day. Over the following months, quietly and carefully, Alicia Prescott unwound what Terrell Allen had spent 4 years tying together. The power of attorney was revoked. The forged signatures on 2 of the loan documents were identified by a handwriting analyst out of Atlanta. The second mortgage was contested. The bank, once presented with the medical records from Ruth's stroke and Marcus's cardiologist, agreed to a settlement rather than face a public hearing about the loan officer who had witnessed the signatures. The house on Magnolia Street could not be brought back. Someone else owned that lot now, and Ruth said quietly one evening that she didn't want it back anyway. Too many good memories in a place that had ended so bad. So Elijah bought her a smaller house 4 blocks over, 1 story, wide doorways, a wraparound porch, and a patch of yard big enough for yellow roses. Terrell was arrested on a Thursday morning in April. He did not resist. He asked through his own attorney if he could speak to his mother before he was booked. Ruth said yes. Elijah drove her down to the sheriff's office himself. What was said between mother and son in that small room, none of them ever told him, and he never asked. When Ruth came out, she was crying, but her back was straight. He took the plea, 18 months with restitution. He served 14. On the Sunday after Terrell came home, he showed up at the new house on Ridgeway Street with a potted plant and stood on the porch a long time before he knocked. Ruth opened the door. She looked at her firstborn son. She looked at the plant. Then she stepped aside and said, "Come on in the kitchen, baby. I got coffee on." And that was the beginning of something none of them had names for yet. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And in the comments below, tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every one. Peace.